Hello and welcome to FO Talks. For your chance to put questions to General David Petraeus. FO Talks is brought to you by Fair Observer, a platform for citizen journalism with over 2,500 contributors from 90 different countries. And we would love you to join the conversation. So do sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, follow us on social media, and of course you can publish with us. General David Petraeus needs little introduction. Well known as the US general who headed multinational forces in Iraq and who commanded US and NATO forces in Afghanistan, he went on to serve as director of the CIA between 2011 and 2012. He's now a partner at KKR and a chairman of the KKR Global Institute and is considered one of the world's top public intellectuals. So welcome to you today, David. Fair Observer's founder and editor-in-chief, Atul Singh, will start the conversation, and then after about 15 minutes, we'll go to questions from viewers. So please do send in your questions here on Zoom or on Facebook, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. Atul, I'll hand over to you for now.
Thank you, Claire. Welcome, David. First off, let me start off by taking you down the memory lane. Do you remember where you were in the early days of November 1989, specifically between 5th and 9th of November 1989?
No, but clearly you do. Tell me, please.
I ask because the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November 1989, and the 5th of November was when 500,000 people appeared in Alexanderplatz, chanting, of course, against the regime and having candles. So my question to you, starting off from 1989, because you are a child of the Cold War, is that was a time Berlin Wall falls, the Baltic republics declare independence. Next year, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. The US pushes Saddam Hussein back, leads a 35-nation coalition, and in 100 hours you have ceasefire. By the end of the year 1991, December 25th, the Soviet flag is lowered. It's unthinkable, I suppose, when you were young. And 26th of December, the Soviet Union is dissolved. That was a heady time. Are we living in a fundamentally more dangerous time 30 years on?
I don't know whether it's more dangerous. I think that's actually quite debatable. If you think of the number of nuclear weaponized missiles and so forth and bombs that were ready and all pointed at each other during the days of the Cold War between the US-led West and the Soviet Union-led Warsaw Pact and so forth. And I served in Germany during that period. I was also a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe during the final years of the Soviet Union. I went to the Soviet Union with the Army Chief of Staff. I was his aide and executive officer during the years that you just described, 89 to 91. And so again, we could tell that something very significant was going on. And then, of course, I read in the National Interest, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. So then we knew for sure what was going to transpire. But that was a very, very significant period, but it was a very turbulent period. If you think about what was going on in Eastern Europe, obviously in the former Soviet republics and all the rest of that. And it was really very skillful diplomacy led by President George H.W. Bush with an extraordinarily talented team around him, with James Baker at his side and so forth, navigating this very, very tricky period. So again, I think that period and the period of the Cold War prior to it was about as dangerous a time as we have ever had, where again, nuclear weapons were on a hair trigger. Having said that, I do think it's accurate to say that the present time is more complex, that the challenges, the issues with which the world has to deal are indeed very, very complex. If you look at the rise of China, very, very significant development, needless to say. We've all read Graham Allison's Destined for War with the no question mark at the end of that. Can the US and China avoid Thucydides' trap? You have a resurgent Russia, which is meddling in a variety of countries, invading two of its neighbors and so forth. You have still a significant and continuing threat of Islamist extremists that has actually metastasized into many countries. It's generally being managed, and that's really all you can do. I don't think you can put a stake through the heart of the ideas or even necessarily the virtual caliphate, the activities in cyberspace that have been so important in animating individuals to come to that particular twisted view of the Muslim faith. You have cyber threats that now are in the trillions of dollars of cyber theft every year. So in other words, this would be one of the top 10 or so economies in the world in aggregate. And then needless to say, we also have a pandemic still in our hands, which is going to take years to deal with in the world outside the developed world, where the vaccination process is going quite well, at least in the US, the UK, yes, Europe has got to get that momentum going again. So again, the issues that are out there are very, very significant. And most predominantly, it is really about the relationship that matters most, not just to the two countries involved, the US and China, but to the rest of the world, how the US-China relationship evolves. And this is one that I hope can be mutually beneficial, that can be one where there is strategic dialogue, such as what has been begun in Anchorage, Alaska. And of course, the beginning of that was a bit turbulent, to put it mildly, a bit undiplomatic between diplomats, but there were going to be more talk. There were more talks after that yesterday evening. Now there will be talks again today. And you can get to points where there can be convergence of interests, certainly combating climate change, combating the pandemic-induced economic downturn. And of course, there are effects of that are going to require international assistance in a number of countries that had what might be termed pre-existing economic conditions, and will need IMF and World Bank and other assistance as well. So again, I think it's very accurate to say that this is the most complex period. And I wouldn't be, again, open and honest with you and blunt as only a soldier knows how to do, if I didn't acknowledge as well that there are enormous challenges in the democracies of the world, not just the least of which are in my own country, which Ronald Reagan described as a beacon on a hill, shining to the rest of the world, an inspiration, an example. And when, of course, you think about what transpired on that hill, on Capitol Hill on 6 January, needless to say, it is the most glaring example of the hyper-partisanship and the differences that exist in my own country. So there's even work to be done by democracies in their form of governance to get back to, again, working together to compromise not being a dirty word in the legislatures of the democracies, and to enable the freedoms that we all cherish to continue and to be celebrated and practiced, but also with functional governance and with economies and that are generally free market capitalist economies. They need to also be examined in some respects. And you're seeing that going on in the US and a number of other democracies.
So let's get to the democracy question. And one of the things, on 6 January, I was on Capitol Hill, as you might remember. I wrote that big article on American democracy in danger of collapsing like Rome's or Greece's or many other democracies in the past. And the question I have for you is that given the polarization, given the discord, given the fact that for the last 15 years, you can't get a treaty through the US Senate, and you have these imaginative workarounds such as the Iran deal. And this is not just the case in the US, the divisions in various democracies, including the country I come from, India, are increasingly deep and wide. Do you see democracy holding?
I do. I think one can make a case that the challenges in the United States not just in the previous administration. This started well before that. I don't know how many administrations you want to go back, but certainly you could see very significant divides emerging absolutely in the Bush 43 administration, certainly through the Obama period.
Yeah, I mean, George Bush Jr. Basically withdrew from Kyoto. I mean, he, long before Donald Trump, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. There was this,
there has been,
shuttle
there has been.
type activity.
What I would say is that what we saw on 6 January was a moment of certainly of real consequence. It was a moment of reckoning in many respects, and many of those who participated are now going to be reckoned with. Again, very, very substantial numbers of charges being brought to them. The rule of law is going to prevail in this case, just as democracy did prevail once that was ended, and they went on and cast the votes, and the next president was indeed certified to be President Joe Biden. But it was a shaky moment, certainly. And there have been shaky moments in other democracies around the world as well. You can walk your way around. You talked a bit about India, but there are certainly countries, our major NATO partners in Europe, who have seen significant challenges in some cases.
Poland, Turkey.
Well,
Brazil. Let's get to South America.
Let's not forget that Marine Le Pen got over 30, I think nearly 35% of the vote in France. Yes, we celebrated that Macron won, but and frankly, Brexit at the end of the day was a manifestation of some of this as well. There are various sources, various factors, including the refugee crisis that the rest of Europe had to deal with in a way that the UK did not, but even the observation of that was enough, again, to contribute, I think, to the Brexit vote at the end of the day. So there's no question that, and by the way, let's also recognize, as Francis Fukuyama has actually, that the end of history didn't end actually in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party and its command economy. And, democracy and capitalism prevailed, as he said it would. But now he has acknowledged more recently that history is back with a vengeance. And what we see now actually is a competition of systems, once again, between the US-led West, democratically elected governments, and again, various forms of free market capitalism, and the Chinese Communist Party, very, very skilled bureaucrats and leaders, and well-educated and so forth, and the state capitalism, which is hyper-competitive in many, many sectors, but still features state-owned enterprises in some others. So that is a systemic competition that is going on. We need to acknowledge that.
Is it the start of another Cold War? From one Cold War?
I don't know. I don't like I think the term Cold War is not helpful. I mean, you may say there's a Cold War in the technology space, perhaps, because there is a fracturing. There is the Great Firewall of China that cuts off 1.3 billion people from the World Wide Web, which is obviously no longer therefore worldwide. And you see concerns about technology made in this place not being here and all the rest of that. That is absolutely going on, and that will continue. But the idea of the Cold War harkens back to an age in which there was very, very little commerce, trade, economic exchange between the US-led West and the Soviet-led East. To the contrary, the US and China were each other's biggest trading partners, or very nearly. I mean, in the US, it's always Canada, Mexico, and China, not necessarily in that order. And we're the biggest trading partner for China, typically, until the imposition of the tariffs in the previous administration. And so again, China is very much a huge part of the international economy. It is the major destination for many of the economies of the world, many of which as well have the US as their principal security partner, and China as their principal export destination. So I think, getting rid of the Cold War idea, label, what have you, is important, and then just to recognize
it's a new era.
You're
saying it's a new era where we have both competition and cooperation. We've got to navigate it. Now, let me let me very quickly ask you something pertinent to America, and this is a foreign policy edition, the latest one, which you might have seen, which says "Decline and Fall: Can America Ever Lead Again?" And I read it cover to cover. And amongst the many things that crop up are references to America facing two big crises. One, the Iraq War, 2003, which according to many writers was a historical blunder. Unlike the Gulf War, America went in without the approval of the UN and lost a lot of credibility, unleashed a refugee crisis on Europe, mayhem in the Middle East, and lost blood and treasure. I mean, that is an argument. That's an argument.
I will not buy, I won't buy the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis came from the Syrian civil war, from the Libyan civil war, and from some others. There was some outflow of refugees from Iraq, but it was never that much until you have the rise of ISIS in Syria.
And that's some people
Iraq.
Credit to Paul Bremer's de-Baathization, a premature de-Baathization of the entire government. I mean, that is all. These are all
which I did not agree, and I did not agree with that. I thought there were two historic mistakes. And by the way, I never will render any kind of judgment on the decision to invade Iraq, having been a 2-star general division commander during the first year, and then a 3-star, and then a 4-star there, of course, during the surge. Because I wrote more letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers than any other commander. That said, there were several decisions early on that were catastrophically bad and cut us off at the knees at a time when we actually had things going quite well.
Yes.
I was in Mosul by the time Ambassador Bremer arrived. He never asked anyone what we thought of firing the Iraqi army, the only true national institution in that country, before he did it. And he did it without telling them what their future was. That was the real flaw. Obviously, there had to be a degree of DDR, of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, as always in a post-conflict situation. But there was no plan for it. It was just, you're all fired, stay home where you have your weapons, of course. And we saw increasingly damaging demonstrations every week for 5 weeks. I finally flew to Baghdad, grabbed the individual who was responsible for that policy by both shoulders. And I knew him from the past. He'd been in the Department of Defense at a senior position. And I said, your policy is killing our troops. And finally, we got through and got a stipend system. But that damage had been done during 5 weeks. And that was really the planting of the original seeds of what came to be the Sunni insurgency, together with de-Baathification down to a level which it shouldn't have gone. There needed to be, of course, de-Baathification absolutely at the top. We were proud, frankly, to kill Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay, when they refused to surrender in Mosul. But when you went down to level 4, I mean, to put it in terms, University of Mosul, which was one of our first priorities to rebuild and reopen, because the people wanted that, the leaders that we had in our interim province council, there were 110 or 120 tenured professors. You know, if you went to school abroad, you entered the Ba'ath Party, you advanced automatically. And again, it wasn't that you did de-Baathifications, it's that you did de-Baathification without an agreed reconciliation process.
Exactly. So let me say that the argument is that hit America hard. That was a big historic blunder. And the second big thing that has hit America hard has been the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And today, American foreign policy specialists are increasingly divided into two camps. One, that America should have continued leadership globally across the full spectrum of issues. And two, America should define its interests more narrowly to both where and what to engage on. Now, which of the two schools do you fall in?
No, I think you can do both, actually. I think there is a need for American leadership around the world, together with our partners and allies, and I very much agree with the thrust of the Biden administration in that regard, consulting with allies and so forth. In fact, last night I was at the UK ambassador's residents for dinner, talking about some of these issues. So I think very much there does need to be leadership by the United States. In the absence of that, there will be vacuums. Others will fill those vacuums who are not necessarily aligned with what it is that we would like to see together with our democratic allies and partners around the world. But there, and yes, there should be a degree of, again, modesty in our goals and objectives. All of these kinds of terms that sound so good in the pages of Foreign Affairs, which I also read. In intellectual humility, all of these, sure, yeah, but then let's talk specifics. Yeah. And that's when grand notions of, quote, offshore balancing and some of these other ideas become a little bit hard to actually turn into practice if you are, say, in uniform or a diplomat or a development worker or any of the others who are engaged around the world, again, with our partners and allies. So again, it has to be some of both. Certainly, there does need to be an awareness that we can overreach and that we need to avoid that. I would contend that there is a need for a sustainable, and that's the big idea here. Sustainability is usually measured in blood and treasure. Sustainable commitment in these irregular wars where we have to continue to deal with what is a generational threat of Islamist extremists, and then in a variety of other places where we are supporting partners or allies who have some kind of security challenge, whether it's in the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, or certainly in the Indo-Pacific. But again, it should be done together. The idea of America First clearly was something that certainly did not strengthen and vital. Now we need to revitalize our allies and alliances and partnerships and so forth. All of that, I think, is absolutely right. The question, of course, as always, is, these are all wonderful macro ideas, but as we say in the investment world as well, every investment is micro, every action is micro. And so
the devil lies in the details.
It always does. And so how do you translate, wonderful macro concepts and ideals and objectives and statements and rhetoric into actual reality on the ground, at sea, in the air, in space, subsea, and even now in cyberspace?
Brilliant. On that note, Claire is back and we'll take questions from the audience. Claire, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Atul. Really fascinating conversation. The questions are coming in thick and fast, but obviously if you do have more questions, do add them either on Zoom or on Facebook, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. The first one is quite an interesting one from William Clun. He says, General Petraeus, I see all those books behind you. He says, which book had the most influence on you? He's listed a couple of suggestions, sure, but maybe we'll leave you to answer that.
Well, there was a book by Bruce Catton, who's one of the great Civil War historians in the United States, who wrote a book called Grant Takes Command, which someone gave to me, a historian at Fort Leavenworth, the Combined Arms Center, gave to me before I went to Iraq for the surge. I'd gotten a rucksack. It ended up on a table by my bunk. In Baghdad, I started going through it, and I thought, wow, it was very instructive to me. How and I don't want to liken the American Civil War and its magnitude to that of the Iraq War. But what he went through was very much what I was experiencing, which is this enormous challenge, the terrible casualties, the political demands, congressional delegations, the press, all of this that you're grappling with, not to mention the enemy and setbacks and mistakes and all the rest. And I found in that book enormous inspiration. Grant at Shiloh, where Sherman comes out of the dark after that really tough first day and says, well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we? And Grant said, yep, lick him tomorrow, though. And that's the kind of just sheer indomitable determination and will that is required sometimes if you are driving a campaign such as we were engaged in the surge in Iraq, which ultimately did drive violence down by some 85%. It stayed down. It kept even going down even farther for the next 3.5 years until tragically it was undone by the highly sectarian decisions of our partner, the Prime Minister of Iraq. And that led to the revival of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq as the Islamic State and all the rest of that and the challenges that ensued from there.
Okay, thank you. Rakesh Kul asks, the recent Eric Schmidt report states that cyber weapons will be the weapons of first choice. Do you see two blocks emerging when it comes to artificial intelligence platforms?
Well, certainly there has to be an enormous investment in artificial intelligence. The future in all areas, not just in the military, the future in every industry is going to be determined in many respects, transformed by machine learning and artificial intelligence. And getting to certain achievements in that world, in those technologies, will confer enormous benefits on those who achieve that. And so clearly there has to be enormous investment in that area. It is interesting that Eric Schmidt headed this and had quite hard-edged recommendations, given that maybe a decade or more ago, when he was the executive chairman of Google, of course, they were still trying to work with those behind the Great Firewall of China and still trying to have some path forward that they could be involved there, and ultimately concluded, unfortunately, that that was not possible. Clearly, there is a fracture in the technology space, and the World Wide Web is not truly worldwide anymore, and we are seeing constraints on it in other locations as well. That, in our view, of course, is not good, with certain areas, of course, that should be limited. And of course, one of the big issues that does have to be addressed is the role of social media and the role of propaganda and conspiracy theories and all the rest of that is often furthered in cyberspace through various social media platforms and internet service providers. That has to be dealt with by democracies. Again, you want free speech, but inevitably there's going to have to be some limit on that. But he had a very, very, again, important set of recommendations. And I think they resonate very much with this new administration. I believe that the next effort, having passed the $1.9 trillion law that will provide enormous support to Americans hurt the most by the pandemic-induced slowdown. Next, hopefully, we'll see the infrastructure bill, which has been needed for a long time. And that will involve undoubtedly a variety of different initiatives that are connected to research and development in, again, the machine learning, artificial intelligence space, and a variety of other advances that are made possible by that, whether it's additive manufacturing, telemedicine, you name it. All of these are very, very significant.
General, we'll just move on to the next question if we can, which is asking about water wars. Rakesh Kul again saying there has been a historic focus on land wars. Will future wars be about water?
Well, I think indeed that we will see increasing conflict over water, and frankly, we already have. If you look at areas in Africa, on the edges of the Sahel and so forth, the desert areas, and of course, because of climate change, these desert areas have been increasing. Desertification, it even has a name. And as you see that, needless to say, you see conflict over that. Now, what we have seen is not yet interstate conflict. You've seen conflict between elements of states, tribes, groupings, etc. And you've seen a degree of migration forced because of that as well. And of course, refugees, that again is one source of refugee flows through North Africa and into Europe. But think about now the issues between Ethiopia and Egypt because of the Renaissance Dam. Think about issues in Iran, where there has been horrible mismanagement of water resources. Think about the issues, we were downstream in the Tigris and Euphrates, the land of the two rivers, ancient Mesopotamia and Iraq. And we watched during our period of involvement there as flows gradually were reduced because of so much upstream activity in Turkey and then also in Syria. So again, these are serious issues, and I think we will see more and more of that. And by the way, you see it in the United States in an interstate way, because many of the resources of the real water resources are in a different state from those like Nevada or others that desperately need those resources. So I think absolutely you're going to see conflict over this. You will see what might be termed water wars. And it is one of many of the scenarios identified in the intelligence community traditionally, along with pandemics, by the way, that generally doesn't get much attention until something happens. So we ought to try to anticipate this a good bit more. And certainly, again, some of the thrust by the new administration in the United States in the climate area, with the appointment of a former Secretary of State as the envoy for the President and Secretary of State in this area, that sends quite a significant message.
Okay, well, you actually mentioned Ethiopia just then, and that leads us on to another question we've had about Africa. Archishman Ray Goswami asks, where do you see the USA's Africa strategy going over the next 4 years? I think he's talking specifically about the jihadist groups in the Sahel.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the threat of Islamist extremists, wherever they are, does demand attention. This is not a problem that you can study until it goes away. It doesn't go away. Indeed, Las Vegas rules aren't in effect in these places. What happens there doesn't stay there. They tend to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees in the case of Syria or Libya, all the way into Europe and our most valued NATO partners and allies. So you do have to pay attention to these, and you do have to, if at all possible, avoid ungoverned spaces anywhere in the world, but especially in the Muslim world, because again, they typically are exploited by extremists. Inevitably, the action against them is going to have to be led by one of the great powers of the world. So typically the US with its constellation of drones. France has been the lead in the Mali area, some other countries elsewhere. But that does have to be undertaken. The key, as I mentioned earlier, is that this should always be a coalition of the willing. It should include Muslim countries, but you have to have a comprehensive approach. One of the ironies or lessons of the last 20 years of war with Islamist extremists is that you cannot counter these terrorists with just counter-terrorist force operations. You can disrupt them with drone strikes or raids or what have you by special forces, but you cannot truly deal with them. To do that, you need a comprehensive approach, of which counterterrorism force operations are a part, but you need all of the elements of that. The key is that we don't want to be doing all of those. Rather, we want to do what we have been able to do in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, where we are providing training, equipping, advice, and assistance, and enablers. Again, the enablers in particular being the drones that can conduct intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, can do some limited precision strikes, the close air support that we have, and then the enormous ability to fuse intelligence and to determine what the enemy is doing. Those are of enormous value to our partners on the ground. And they can then deal with the frontline fighting, with the restoration of basic services, the repair of damaged infrastructure, and so forth, as we are seeing with fits and starts, to be sure, in Iraq, in Syria, and in some of the other places. So all of that is true of the areas of Africa, which sadly are afflicted and in many cases, preyed on by, of course, Islamist extremists. And we've seen that flare up yet again in northern Nigeria, most recently, certainly in the Mali area, and as well in Eastern Africa. So you do have to keep an eye on that. But I should note that not only do we have to do that, we have to do it while shifting the major focus, certainly, to the Indo-Pacific and to the emergence there of what in many respects is a competition, but in some other ways can be a collaboration and the pursuit of common interests. And obviously we want to play on those to the extent that we possibly can. Again, I am one who very much, a soldier above all, wants to see as mutually beneficial a relationship as is possible between the United States and China. We can achieve a great deal more together than we can in conflict.
Do you share Admiral Davidson's concerns about China supplanting the US in that region? And sorry, Atul, we'll go to your question in just a moment.
Well, look, if you have a theater commander who's been, on the ground, if you will, or at sea, in the air, and so forth, the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Davison, who is just wrapping up a 3-year tour there, clearly you have to take his concerns very seriously. That is his job. And prior to that, he was the naval component commander for the Indo-Pacific region. So, yeah, you have to take that very, very seriously. And we've got to be sure that we have the capabilities that are necessary to deter. And of course, deterrence is a function of two factors. It is your capabilities and the perceived willingness of you and your coalition partners to use those capabilities, to employ them. And I think that those elements are present, but they're always in constant need of shoring up. And what he was describing is some very specific objectives and needs when it comes to, as an example, air and ballistic missile defense of the island of Guam and the island in the Marianas and a variety of other places. He has an initiative that he has submitted to Congress, which requires tens of billions of dollars, that I'm sure is going to get very serious attention on Capitol Hill and in the White House.
Atul, you had a question?
Yes, I had a follow-up question. So when speaking about Islamic extremism or terrorism,
we should be very specific. This is Islamist extremist.
Islamist, okay.
Yes.
Islamist, okay. So let us also examine the role of certain state actors. Iran has used terror as an instrument of foreign policy since the 1979 revolution. There is a very strong argument to be made that Saudi funding of Wahhabi Islam in countries all over the world has also moved the pendulum towards Islamism. Turkey has
although very diminished in recent years and specifically addressed by the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in recent years. That's right. One of the encouraging developments there, frankly, as right. is the practice of Wahhabism in the kingdom itself.
Okay, but Turkey has emerged as well, promoting certain groups for its geopolitical interests. Pakistan, since 1971, or rather since the Zia days, General Zia-ul-Haq unleashed a policy of bleeding India through 1,000 cuts, Operation Tupac. So there have been state actors that have used terror as an instrument of foreign policy or promoted ideologies that promote terror. So what can we do, or what can anyone do about this trend?
Oh, you respond appropriately. And again, try to ensure that deterrence is in effect, at the very least, for state-on-state kinds of activities. And then also take actions when proxies are being used, such as, again, Lebanese Hezbollah, such as the Iranian-supported Shia militia in Iraq, the tragedy of which is, of course, we defeated them during the second half of the surge in Iraq, March and April of 2008, these huge battles in Basra, other southern cities, Sadr City, Qadamiyah, and so forth in Baghdad itself, only to see them come back in response to the Islamic State, which was among one more of the tragedies brought about by the rise of the Islamic State and the threat that it posed to literally to Baghdad itself. So no, you have to push back at them. You have to, again, we need to address these issues. This is part of this complex. And again, remember what we sort of concluded, I think, that this may not be the most dangerous period in history, but it is the period of the most complex array of challenges and threats that has existed, certainly in modern memory. And that is very much one of those threats and challenges. And of course, you have that dilemma of do you focus only on constraining and reversing the Iran nuclear program, or do you insist that part of that effort has to be expanded to include support of these, again, Shia militias in various places that are making life so difficult? You know, Iran is trying to Lebanonize Iraq and Syria, and maybe to a degree Yemen. And Lebanonization means that you have a powerful militia on the street, Lebanese Hezbollah, and you also have considerable power in the legislature and the parliament, as Hezbollah and its coalition does in Beirut, and as these militia elements do in Baghdad as well, although not to the level, nor with the cohesion that you see certainly in Beirut. And of course, they want to retain or achieve really the control for this Shia crescent that runs from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and down into southern Lebanon. And those are very, very worrisome threats. And those are ones that we do need to focus some attention on, but not getting so riveted on those. Again, these can be managed, I believe, while we shift the biggest focus of our whole of government. And by the way, it's actually whole of governments, because we want all of our allies and partners to get together with us when we are working on defining this relationship between the existing power and the rising power, US and China, and so hopefully not like Sparta and Athens.
Yeah, let me interject. So you've talked about China and the US and Graham Ellison's reference of Thucydides' trap. And now the US has cheap gas. For long, the US was stuck in the Middle East because of oil. So does that mean now the Asia pivot that Obama pioneered, in a way, is going to be fait accompli? Bit by bit, there'll be less time and attention and energy and money and troops for the Middle East, despite all your talk about focusing on the problems in the Middle East. Is now the real focus China?
I think you can do this with vastly fewer forces. When I took command of U.S. Central Command, which of course includes everything from Egypt to Pakistan, Kazakhstan to Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off of Libya, we used to proudly address 90% of the world's problems at that time. We had 250,000 American men and women in uniform. I mean, that's dramatically way down. It's probably under 1/6 of that at this point, and it can be. And it can probably be slimmed down even a bit further, but it can't be ended. And by the way, yes, we no longer have any dependence really on Mideast oil or natural gas. We are a net exporter even of crude oil, much less natural gas. We're the biggest producer of natural gas and generally crude oil, depending on, give or take a bit with Russia and occasionally Saudi Arabia. But we still have an interest, a vital interest, in ensuring the free flow of energy resources through the Gulf and east and west, because that fuels the global economy. And even though we are less dependent on trade than many other countries, we're maybe 75% domestic consumption of our GDP in the US, we still do indeed depend on an international economy, and we still want that economy to be fueled. So certainly that is one of the many interests that should maintain attention in the Gulf region. Others, again, combating Iran, ensuring non-proliferation, ensuring the Iranian nuclear program never approaches the enrichment to weapons grade, combating Iranian-supported proxy elements, combating Islamist extremists. Again, there is no shortage of challenges, but by and large, I think we can do this by providing training, equipping, advising, and assisting and enabling assets rather than by doing it ourselves, as we had to do back in the day when we had 165,000 American men and women in uniform in Iraq alone during the surge there, 100,000 when I was privileged to command in Afghanistan. We don't need anywhere remotely near that level of forces at this point in time because of the way we have been able to change how we operate, and because of the addition of this constellation of drones that has proven so important to our partners on the ground.
General, can we just ask one last viewer question and then we'll have to wrap up because we are slightly overrunning. This is a question from Tara Whitaker. He asks, how do you see the Syrian reconstruction proceeding, particularly the interaction between Russia and Iran and those who can afford to rebuild the country, such as the US and Europe and Japan?
Well, I don't see it proceeding right now because, of course, there is not the kind of political agreement that would enable that to go forward. And I doubt that as long as Bashar al-Assad is still on the throne, if you will, in Damascus, that will go forward. So So there is no immediate prospect, I don't think, of anything other than Humpty Dumpty staying broken. And it is an open question as to whether Humpty Dumpty can be put back together. What would the guarantees be, and how verifiable would they be for our partners, for example, in northeastern Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces there? What about the areas that are largely controlled by Turkey in the northern part of the country? And again, you can walk your way around Syria. Obviously, this is something with which I was pretty seized as the first commander in Iraq, U.S. Central Command, and obviously as the director of the CIA as well in the early years of what has become the Syrian civil war. But again, without that kind of political architecture and agreement and so forth, I think I see very little prospect of the kind of unification of Syria once again, and therefore of the reconstruction that one would like to see. This is the greatest humanitarian tragedy of certainly the previous decade, most likely. There have been some other candidates for that, unfortunately. But if you think of Syria, I mean, that was a geopolitical Chernobyl. It was the meltdown of a country with half of the country roughly displaced and half of that displaced externally. And many of those individuals will never be able to go back home. It is a true tragedy. It's one of those in which there were many lessons learned, I believe, in the West, in my own country and elsewhere. But at this point in time, until you can see the kind of path forward politically that is forged by all the countries that are engaged there and those in Damascus, it's very difficult to see how there can be much reconstruction other than that is taking place in areas, again, controlled, say, by partners of the US, partners of Turkey, and then even to a degree, the partners of Russia and Iran. But a tragedy of a country.
Absolutely. I think we'll probably have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, General.
The pleasure was mine. It was great to be with you and great to see you again, Atul.
Well,
and
pleasure was all mine.
Thank you, Atul, as well, for your brilliant line of questioning. And thank you to you at home for all your questions and your participation and your comments that have been coming in here on the chat channel. Let me just say that you can continue the conversation at Fair Observer. You can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our channel, and of course, follow us on social media. So please do join us and become a Fair Observer. Thank you.
Best of luck with Fair Observer.
Thank you.